Sometimes the most profound moments of justice come when we least expect them. Today's story takes us to a small-town diner in Nebraska, where a teenage girl faced the ultimate humiliation when a group of teenagers mocked her father's Purple Heart medal. What they didn't know was that her father had earned that medal in the most extraordinary circumstances during the Vietnam War, and what none of them could have predicted was that a retired four-star general would walk through that diner door. Just moments later, changing everything forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn air in Millbrook, Nebraska carried the scent of harvest and promise as 16-year-old Sarah Martinez made her way down Main Street toward Rosie's diner. It was October 10th, 2019, and the small town of just over 3,000 residents was buzzing with the usual Tuesday afternoon energy. Farmers were finishing their lunch breaks, discussing corn yields and weather patterns, while high school students who had early dismissal were scattered throughout the local businesses, killing time before after-school activities began. Sarah clutched her father's Purple Heart medal in her small hands, the weight of it far greater than its physical mass suggested. The medal was encased in a simple black presentation box, its purple ribbon slightly faded from years of careful handling. Today was Veterans Day presentation day at Millbrook High School, and Sarah had volunteered to share her father's story with her American history class. She had spent weeks preparing her presentation, researching the significance of the Purple Heart, and gathering the courage to speak publicly about something so deeply personal to her family. Miguel Martinez, Sarah's father, had served as a combat medic in the Vietnam War from 1969 to 1971. He had been just 19 years old when he first set foot on Vietnamese soil, carrying nothing but a medical bag, an unwavering sense of duty, and a photograph of his high school sweetheart Sarah's mother, Elena. The Purple Heart he earned came with a story that Miguel rarely shared, even with his own family. The weight of what he had experienced in the jungles of Southeast Asia was something he carried silently, choosing instead to focus on building a peaceful life for his family in the heartland of America. Rosie's diner had been a Millbrook institution for over 40 years. The red vinyl booths, checkered floor tiles, and chrome fixtures hadn't changed much since the 1980s, giving the place a timeless quality that residents cherished. The walls were decorated with photographs of local high school football teams, harvest festivals, and community events spanning decades. Behind the counter, handwritten signs advertised daily specials in Rosie's distinctive cursive handwriting. Tuesday special, meatloaf and mashed potatoes, $8.99, and fresh apple pie. Made this morning. Sarah had chosen to stop at Rosie's before heading back to school, because she needed a few quiet minutes to collect her thoughts. Public speaking had never been her strong suit, and the importance of today's presentation weighed heavily on her mind. She wanted to honor her father's service properly, to convey not just the facts about his military record, but the profound impact his experience had on their family and community. Miguel had taught her that freedom wasn't free, that the liberties they enjoyed in their small Nebraska town had been purchased with the blood and sacrifice of countless service members. As Sarah pushed open the glass door of the diner, the familiar sound of the bell announcing her arrival, she was greeted by the warm atmosphere she had known since childhood. The lunch rush was winding down, leaving only a few scattered customers. Old-timer Harold Peterson nursing his third cup of coffee while working on a crossword puzzle. Young mother Jenny Walsh feeding her toddler in a corner booth, and unfortunately, a group of 5 teenagers from the local high school who had claimed the large circular booth near the back of the restaurant. Sarah recognized the group immediately, though they moved in very different social circles. There was Brad Thompson, the quarterback of the football team, whose father owned the largest farm implement dealership in the county. Beside him sat Ashley Morrison, whose family had run the local bank for 3 generations. The other 3, Kyle, Madison and Trevor were all from prominent families in town, the kind of teenagers who had never wanted for anything and had little understanding of sacrifice or struggle. Sarah slid into a booth near the front of the diner, placing the Purple Heart case carefully on the table in front of her. She ordered a hot chocolate from Rosie herself, a kindly woman in her 70s who had known Sarah since she was old enough to see over the counter. As Sarah waited for her drink, she opened the case and looked down at her father's medal, its bronze surface catching the afternoon light streaming through the diner's large front windows. The Purple Heart is one of the oldest military decorations in American history. First established by General George Washington in 1782, originally called the Badge of Military Merit, it was revived in 1932 and renamed the Purple Heart in honor of the bicentennial of Washington's birth. The medal is awarded to members of the armed forces who are wounded or killed in action against an enemy of the United States. It represents not just physical sacrifice, but the willingness to put one's life on the line for the principles of freedom and democracy. Sarah's father had explained to her that receiving a Purple Heart was both an honor and a burden. It meant that he had answered his country's call to service and had paid a physical price for that service. But it also meant that he carried within him the memories of combat, the loss of fellow soldiers, and the complex emotions that came with surviving when others did not. Miguel had been wounded by shrapnel from a mortar attack while treating wounded soldiers during the Tet Offensive in 1968, but he had continued to serve, ultimately saving dozens of lives during his tour of duty. As Sarah sat in the diner, preparing for her presentation, she felt the weight of responsibility that came with sharing such a significant piece of American military history. She wanted her classmates to understand that behind every medal, every ribbon, every military decoration, there was a human story of courage, sacrifice, and service. Her father's Purple Heart wasn't just a piece of metal and fabric, it was a symbol of the price of freedom and the valor of those who serve. The Martinez family's connection to military service ran deeper than just Miguel's Purple Heart. Sarah's grandfather, Roberto Martinez, had served in World War II as part of the 65th Infantry Regiment, known as the Borinqueniers, a segregated unit composed primarily of Puerto Rican soldiers. Roberto had fought in the Pacific Theater, participating in campaigns across multiple islands, earning a Bronze Star for his valor during the Battle of Luzon in the Philippines. When he returned home after the war, he had settled in Nebraska, drawn by the promise of good farmland and the opportunity to build a new life for his family. Roberto's stories of military service had shaped Miguel's understanding of duty and honor from an early age. Despite facing discrimination both during and after his military service, Roberto had never spoken with bitterness about his time in the Army. Instead, he emphasized the bonds he had formed with his fellow soldiers and the pride he felt in serving his adopted country. He would tell young Miguel about the importance of standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult, and about the responsibility that came with being an American citizen. Miguel had grown up hearing these stories while working alongside his father on their small farm outside Millbrook. The physical demands of farm work had prepared him well for military training, but it was the values instilled by Roberto that truly prepared him for the challenges he would face in Vietnam. Roberto had taught him that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite that fear. He had learned that leadership meant taking care of those around you, especially when they couldn't take care of themselves. When Miguel received his draft notice in 1969, Roberto had driven him to the recruitment center in Omaha. The drive had been mostly silent, both men understanding the gravity of the moment. As they sat in the parking lot before Miguel went inside, Roberto had reached into his pocket and pulled out his own Bronze Star medal. "This belongs to our family now," he had said, placing it in Miguel's hands. "But you bring it back, and you bring yourself back. Your country needs you, but your family needs you more." Miguel's time in Vietnam had been transformative in ways that no training could have prepared him for. As a combat medic with the 1st Infantry Division, he had been responsible for providing medical care to wounded soldiers under the most challenging conditions imaginable. The jungles of Southeast Asia presented constant dangers: enemy fire, booby traps, tropical diseases, and the psychological stress of witnessing the horrors of war on a daily basis. But Miguel had found purpose in his role as a healer, knowing that his skills and courage could mean the difference between life and death for his fellow soldiers. The incident that earned Miguel his Purple Heart had occurred during a fierce firefight near the Cambodian border in January 1970. His unit had been ambushed while on a reconnaissance mission, and several soldiers had been wounded in the initial attack. Despite heavy enemy fire, Miguel had repeatedly exposed himself to danger to reach wounded comrades, providing life-saving medical treatment under conditions that would have broken many men. It was during his 4th trip into the kill zone that a mortar round exploded nearby, sending shrapnel into his leg and back. Even wounded, Miguel had continued to treat other soldiers until additional medical help arrived. His actions that day had saved the lives of 6 soldiers, but the physical and emotional scars from that firefight would stay with him for the rest of his life. The Purple Heart ceremony had been held at a field hospital 2 weeks later, with Miguel still recovering from his wounds. The commanding officer who presented the medal had told him that his courage under fire exemplified the best traditions of the United States Army and that his actions would be remembered long after the war ended. But for Miguel, the medal represented more than just personal recognition. It symbolized the bond he shared with every soldier who had served, the brotherhood forged in the crucible of combat, and the responsibility to honor those who had made the ultimate sacrifice. When he returned home to Nebraska in 1971, he had struggled with what many veterans experienced: the challenge of readjusting to civilian life after experiencing the intensity and trauma of combat. Roberto had been instrumental in helping Miguel heal and find his place in post-war America. Together, they had worked the family farm, with Roberto patiently helping his son process the experiences he had gone through. Roberto understood the difficulty of carrying the weight of military service, having gone through his own period of adjustment after World War II. He encouraged Miguel to find constructive ways to channel his experiences, to use his understanding of sacrifice and service to make positive contributions to his community. Miguel had met Elena at a Veterans Day celebration in 1972, drawn to her quiet strength and genuine interest in understanding his experiences. Elena's father had served in Korea, so she had grown up understanding the unique challenges faced by military families. Their courtship had been built on mutual respect and shared values, with Elena helping Miguel see that his military service was something to be proud of, not something to hide from. When Sarah was born in 1983, Miguel had made a conscious decision to share his military experiences with her in age-appropriate ways. He wanted her to understand the importance of service, sacrifice, and civic responsibility, but he also wanted to protect her from the darker aspects of his combat experiences. As she grew older, he had gradually shared more details about his time in Vietnam, always emphasizing the positive aspects, the friendships he had formed, the lives he had saved, and the pride he felt in serving his country. Sarah had grown up with a deep appreciation for military service and a clear understanding of the sacrifices made by veterans and their families. She had participated in Veterans Day ceremonies since elementary school, helped organize care packages for deployed soldiers, and volunteered at the local VFW hall. Her father's Purple Heart wasn't just a family heirloom. It was a reminder of the ongoing responsibility to honor and support those who serve. For weeks leading up to her Veterans Day presentation, Sarah had immersed herself in research about the Vietnam War, the Purple Heart Medal, and her father's specific unit. She had spent countless hours at the Millbrook Public Library, reading books about the 1st Infantry Division and the major battles they had fought. Mrs. Henderson, the head librarian, had been particularly helpful, ordering special materials. Through interlibrary loans and helping Sarah access online databases that contained detailed military records. Sarah's research had revealed the staggering scope of American involvement in Vietnam. She learned that over 2.7 million Americans had served in Southeast Asia between 1964 and 1975, with more than 58,000 making the ultimate sacrifice. The Purple Heart had been awarded to over 351,000 service members during the Vietnam conflict, making it one of the most significant periods for the medal in American military history. Each of these statistics represented real people's sons, daughters, fathers, and mothers who had answered their country's call to service. The more Sarah learned about her father's service, the more impressed she became with his courage and dedication. Combat medics faced unique challenges in Vietnam, as they were often targeted by enemy forces who understood that eliminating medical personnel could demoralize entire units. Despite this danger, medics like her father had maintained their commitment to the Hippocratic Oath, treating wounded soldiers regardless of their own safety. The mortality rate among combat medics in Vietnam was significantly higher than among other military occupational specialties, making her father's survival and successful service even more remarkable. Sarah had also researched the specific battle where her father had earned his Purple Heart. The area near the Cambodian border had been a hotbed of enemy activity, with North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces using the border region as a sanctuary and supply route. American forces had conducted numerous operations in this area, often facing well-entrenched enemies who knew the terrain intimately. The firefight where Miguel was wounded had been part of a larger operation designed to disrupt enemy supply lines and gather intelligence about enemy movements. In preparing her presentation, Sarah had wanted to include not just the facts about her father's service, but also the broader context of what military service meant to American families. She had interviewed several other veterans in Millbrook, including Mr. Patterson, who had served in Korea, Mrs. Williams, who had been a Navy nurse during the Gulf War, and young Sergeant Rodriguez, who had recently returned from Afghanistan. These conversations had given her a deeper appreciation for the diversity of military experiences and the common threads that connected all veterans. Sarah's presentation outline included several key components. She planned to begin with a brief overview of the Vietnam War and America's involvement in Southeast Asia. She would then discuss the role of combat medics and the specific challenges they faced in jungle warfare. The centerpiece of her presentation would be her father's story, including the circumstances surrounding his Purple Heart Award. She planned to conclude by discussing the ongoing responsibility of civilians to support veterans and active-duty military personnel. Miguel had been initially reluctant to have his military service highlighted in such a public way. Like many veterans, he preferred to keep his war experiences private, feeling that civilian audiences often couldn't truly understand the complexity of combat situations. However, Sarah had convinced him that sharing his story could help educate her classmates about the realities of military service and the sacrifices made by veterans and their families. To prepare for potential questions from her classmates, Sarah had asked her father to provide more details about his time in Vietnam. These conversations had been difficult for both of them, as Miguel struggled to find ways to describe his experiences that were honest but appropriate for a teenage audience. He had emphasized the bonds he had formed with his fellow soldiers, the pride he felt in serving as a medic, and the importance of the mission they had been assigned. Miguel had also shared some of the challenges he had faced upon returning home from Vietnam. Unlike veterans of World War II who had been welcomed home as heroes, many Vietnam veterans had faced indifference or even hostility from civilian populations who opposed the war. Miguel remembered feeling isolated and misunderstood during his early years back in Nebraska, struggling to find his place in a society that seemed eager to forget about the war and those who had fought in it. Sarah's presentation Materials included photographs that Miguel had taken during his time in Vietnam, official documentation of his Purple Heart Award, and letters he had written home to his family. She had also prepared a visual timeline showing major events of the Vietnam War and how they related to her father's service. Mrs. Patterson, her American history teacher, had been supportive of the presentation and had helped Sarah structure her remarks for maximum educational impact. The night before her presentation, Sarah had practiced her speech multiple times, with Miguel and Elena providing feedback and encouragement. Miguel had reminded her that the most important aspect of her presentation wasn't the specific details of his service, but the broader message about the importance of remembering and honoring those who serve. He wanted her classmates to understand that military service was about more than individual heroism. It was about collective sacrifice for the common good. Asterisk as Sarah sat in Rosie's diner, reviewing her notes one final time, she felt the weight of responsibility that came with representing not just her father's story, but the experiences of all veterans. She understood that many of her classmates had little direct connection to military service and that her presentation might be their first real exposure to the realities of war and military sacrifice. She was determined to do justice to her father's legacy and to help her peers develop a deeper appreciation for the freedoms they enjoyed as Americans. The Purple Heart case sat open on the table before her, the medal's bronze surface reflecting the afternoon light streaming through the diner's windows. Sarah touched the ribbon gently, thinking about all the hands that had held this medal. Commanding officer who had presented it to her father in a field hospital in Vietnam, her father who had carried it home and treasured it for 50 years, and now her own hands as she prepared to share its story with a new generation. The peaceful atmosphere of Rosie's diner was shattered when Brad Thompson's voice carried across the restaurant with unmistakable arrogance. "Hey, check out what little Martinez has got there," he called out to his friends, his voice dripping with the kind of casual cruelty that only comes from a teenager who has never faced real consequences for his actions. "Looks like she's playing dress-up with some old military stuff." Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized that Brad and his group had noticed the Purple Heart case on her table. She instinctively moved to close the case, but it was too late. Ashley Morrison had already left their booth and was walking over, her designer jeans and perfectly styled hair making her look like she had stepped out of a magazine rather than a small-town high school. "Oh my God, is that supposed to be real?" Ashley asked with a laugh that had no warmth in it. She reached toward the medal case before Sarah could stop her, picking up the Purple Heart and examining it like it was a curious trinket she had found at a garage sale. "This looks like something you could buy at a costume shop. Did your dad get this from a military surplus store?" The other teenagers had now gathered around Sarah's booth, forming a semicircle that made her feel trapped and vulnerable. Brad leaned against the table, his Letterman jacket hanging open to reveal an expensive polo shirt underneath. "My dad says anyone can buy these things online," he said with authority that came from never having been challenged on anything important. "Real heroes don't need to carry their medals around for show." Kyle Peterson, whose father ran the local insurance agency, chimed in with his own contribution to the mockery. "Yeah, and real veterans don't send their kids to school with props for attention. This is probably just some fake thing she bought to make herself seem more interesting." The cruelty in his voice was casual, almost conversational, as if he were discussing the weather rather than attacking something sacred to Sarah's family. Sarah felt her face burning with embarrassment and anger, but she struggled to find her voice. The combination of being outnumbered, caught off guard, and dealing with the social dynamics of high school made it difficult for her to mount an effective defense. "It's real," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "My father earned it in Vietnam. He was a combat medic." This statement only seemed to embolden the group further. Madison Wright, whose family owned the largest car dealership in the county, laughed openly. "Oh please, Everyone knows that all those Vietnam guys just make up stories about how tough they were. My grandfather says most of them never even saw real combat. They just want people to feel sorry for them. Trevor Hamilton, the son of the town's only lawyer, added his own twist to the harassment. Besides, Purple Hearts are basically participation trophies for people who were too stupid to stay out of the way of enemy fire. It's not like it's a Medal of Honor or something that actually matters. His comment demonstrated not just cruelty, but a fundamental ignorance about military service and sacrifice. That would have been shocking if it weren't so common among privileged teenagers who had never experienced hardship. Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, but she fought them back with every ounce of strength she possessed. She thought about her father, about all the stories he had shared with her about his fellow soldiers, about the men who hadn't come home from Vietnam. "You don't understand," she said, her voice growing stronger despite her emotional state. "My father saved people's lives. He risked everything to help other soldiers." "Sure he did," Brad said with exaggerated sarcasm. "And I suppose he single-handedly won the war, too. Look, Sarah, we get that you want to be special or whatever, but making up war stories about your dad is pretty pathetic, even for you." The casual way he dismissed decades of service and sacrifice revealed the depth of his ignorance and privilege. Ashley was still holding the Purple Heart, turning it over in her hands like she was examining a curious artifact. "This ribbon doesn't even look that old," she observed with the confidence of someone who had never studied military history or regulations. "And look at this case, you can tell it's not vintage. This is definitely some cheap reproduction she bought online." The situation was rapidly spiraling out of control, and Sarah felt increasingly powerless to defend her father's honor against the overwhelming force of their collective mockery. Other customers in the diner were beginning to notice the commotion, but none seemed inclined to intervene. Harold Peterson looked up from his crossword puzzle with a frown, clearly disapproving of the teenager's behavior, but unsure whether it was his place to get involved. Jenny Walsh was focused on keeping her toddler entertained and seemed oblivious to the drama unfolding nearby. "Maybe we should check online right now," Kyle suggested, pulling out his smartphone with malicious glee. "I bet we can find this exact same medal on eBay for like $20. Then we'll know for sure that little Martinez here is just another attention-seeking fake." The group's behavior was attracting more attention throughout the diner. Rosie herself had emerged from behind the counter, her expression showing concern and growing anger as she witnessed the harassment of one of her regular customers. At 73 years old, Rosie had seen enough of life to recognize cruelty when she witnessed it, and she was beginning to move toward the group with the clear intention of putting a stop to their behavior. Sarah made one more attempt to defend her father's honor and reclaim his medal. "Please give that back," she said, reaching toward Ashley. "You don't understand what you're holding. That medal represents real sacrifice, real courage. My father was wounded while saving other soldiers' lives." But Ashley pulled the medal away from Sarah's reach, holding it up like a trophy. "Oh, I understand perfectly," she said with vicious satisfaction. "I understand that you're so desperate for attention that you're willing to lie about your family's military service. This is probably the most pathetic thing I've ever seen." The moment seemed frozen in time, with Sarah standing helplessly as her father's most precious possession was held hostage by teenagers who couldn't begin to comprehend its true value or meaning. The situation continued to deteriorate as the group of teenagers grew bolder in their harassment. Brad Thompson, emboldened by what he perceived as Sarah's weakness, decided to escalate the confrontation further. "You know what I think?" he announced loudly enough for the entire diner to hear. "I think this whole thing is just another sob story from the Martinez family. First, they come to our town claiming they belong here, and now they're making up war hero stories to try to get sympathy." His words carried undertones that went beyond simple bullying. revealing prejudices that had been passed down through generations in some families despite Millbrook's generally welcoming nature. Sarah felt the sting of his words not just as an attack on her father's service, but as an assault on her family's right to call Millbrook home, despite the fact that the Martinez family had been part of the community for over 30 years. Ashley Morrison seemed to be enjoying her role as the ringleader of the harassment. She continued to hold the Purple Heart medal, now treating it like a prop in her performance of cruelty. "Look at this," she said, addressing her friends while completely ignoring Sarah's obvious distress. "The ribbon is all wrong. I've seen real military medals in movies, and they don't look anything like this cheap imitation." Trevor Hamilton, apparently not wanting to be outdone in the competition for cruelty, decided to add his own expertise to the discussion. "My uncle was in the Army, and he told me that real Purple Hearts come with official documentation. Where's your paperwork, Sarah? Oh wait, let me guess, it got lost in a fire or something equally convenient." His mocking tone and know-it-all attitude demonstrated the dangerous combination of ignorance and confidence that often characterizes teenage bullying. Kyle Peterson had been busy with his smartphone, apparently searching for information to support their attack on Sarah's credibility. "Here we go," he announced triumphantly, holding up his phone screen. "You can buy replica Purple Hearts online for $29.99. Free shipping if you order 2 or more. This is definitely one of those cheap knockoffs." Madison Wright joined in with her own contribution to the harassment campaign. "Honestly, this is just embarrassing. Like, we all know that Sarah's family doesn't have money for the real thing. So why are we even pretending this is authentic? My dad says her father works at the grain elevator, which is basically minimum wage. No real war hero would end up in a job like that." Her comments revealed not just cruelty toward Sarah, but a fundamental misunderstanding of how many veterans struggled to readjust to civilian life after their military service. The idea that a person's post-service employment somehow invalidated their military achievements showed the depth of her ignorance about veteran issues and the challenges faced by many who had served their country with distinction. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the coordinated attack on her family's honor and her father's service record. The tears she had been fighting were now threatening to spill over, but she continued to struggle against showing weakness in front of her tormentors. "Please," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "just give me back my father's medal. You don't understand what it means to our family." But her plea only seemed to encourage the group further. Brad leaned closer to her, his voice taking on a mock sympathetic tone that was somehow more cruel than his earlier aggression. "Oh, we understand perfectly, Sarah. We understand that you're so desperate to fit in that you're willing to make up elaborate lies about your family. The truth is that your dad probably never even left Nebraska, let alone went to Vietnam." Ashley began examining the medal case more closely, apparently looking for additional ammunition for their attack. "Look at this case," she announced to the group. "This is clearly brand new. You can even see the price tag residue on the bottom. Sarah probably bought this whole setup yesterday, just for her little presentation today." Trevor stepped closer to Sarah, his height and aggressive posture making her feel even more intimidated. "You know what the really sad part is?" he said with false concern. "The fact that you thought you could fool anyone with this obvious fake. Did you really think we were stupid enough to fall for such a pathetic lie?" The cruelty of their words was matched by their complete lack of empathy for Sarah's emotional state. Kyle seemed particularly pleased with himself as he continued his online research. "Oh, this is even better," he announced. "According to this website, there are thousands of fake Purple Hearts in circulation. It's actually a federal crime to falsely claim military honors. Maybe we should report the Martinez family to the authorities." Madison laughed at Kyle's suggestion, clearly enjoying the power she felt in participating in Sarah's humiliation. "That would be amazing. Can you imagine Sarah's dad getting arrested for stolen valor? Although I guess you can't really steal something that was never real in the first place. The group's behavior had now attracted the attention of everyone in the diner. Harold Peterson had put down his crossword puzzle entirely and was watching the scene with obvious disapproval. Jenny Walsh had stopped feeding her toddler and was looking concerned about the escalating situation. Even the cook could be heard moving around in the kitchen, apparently aware that something significant was happening in the dining area. Rosie had been making her way toward the confrontation, but she was moving slowly due to her age and the difficulty of navigating between the closely spaced tables. Her expression showed a mixture of anger and determination that suggested she was prepared to put an end to the harassment, regardless of the teenagers' social status in the community. Sarah made one final attempt to reason with her tormentors. "This medal belonged to my grandfather before my father," she said, hoping that invoking additional family military service might give them pause. "Our family has served in World War II, Vietnam, and— oh, now it's a family heirloom?" Brad interrupted with exaggerated amazement. "The story keeps getting better and better. What's next, Sarah? Are you going to tell us that your great-great-grandfather fought in the Civil War too?" The moment hung suspended in the diner's increasingly tense atmosphere, with Sarah surrounded by her tormentors while other customers watched helplessly, unsure whether or how to intervene in the escalating confrontation. The bell above Rosie's diner door chimed with its familiar metallic ring, but this time it announced the arrival of someone who would change everything. A tall, distinguished man in his 70s stepped through the doorway, his posture unmistakably military despite his civilian clothes. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, his khaki slacks pressed to perfection, and his polo shirt bore a small embroidered insignia that few would recognize but spoke volumes to those who knew military traditions. General William Bill Morrison, United States Army retired, had stopped at Rosie's diner purely by chance. He had been driving through Nebraska on his way to visit his daughter in Colorado, when he decided to take a break from the interstate highway and explore some of the small towns that dotted the American heartland. As a career military officer who had served for 37 years, General Morrison had developed a deep appreciation for the communities that formed the backbone of American society, and Millbrook seemed like exactly the kind of place he enjoyed. Discovering what the teenagers harassing Sarah didn't know was that General Morrison had commanded the 1st Infantry Division during the 1990s, the same unit in which Miguel Martinez had served as a combat medic 25 years earlier. The general had made it his personal mission to learn about the history of his division, studying the service records of soldiers who had served before his time and honoring their contributions to the unit's proud legacy. As General Morrison entered the diner, his trained eye immediately assessed the situation unfolding near the front windows. Years of military leadership had taught him to read body language and social dynamics quickly, and he could see that a young girl was being harassed by a group of older teenagers. The protective instincts that had guided him through decades of military service immediately kicked in, and he began moving toward the confrontation with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to taking charge in difficult situations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The general's approach was noticed first by Harold Peterson, who recognized the unmistakable bearing of a senior military officer, even in civilian clothes. Harold had served as a sergeant in Korea and could spot a career soldier from across a crowded room. He watched with interest as the distinguished stranger moved through the diner with obvious purpose, wondering what role this newcomer might play in the unfolding drama. Brad Thompson was in the middle of another cruel comment when General Morrison reached their group. "Excuse me," the general said in a voice that carried the authority of decades of command experience. "I couldn't help but notice that you young people seem to be having a discussion about military service." As someone who spent most of his adult life in the Army, I find such conversations quite interesting. The teenagers were momentarily taken aback by the interruption, unsure how to respond to this unexpected adult intervention. Ashley Morrison still held Sarah's Purple Heart medal, but she instinctively moved it behind her back, somehow sensing that this stranger might not approve of her behavior. The general's presence had an immediate effect on the group dynamics, causing them to step back slightly and creating space for Sarah to breathe. "This is a private conversation," Brad said with less confidence than he had shown moments earlier. Despite his arrogance, he could recognize authority when he encountered it, and something about this older man's demeanor suggested that he was not someone to be dismissed lightly. "We're just talking with our classmate about her presentation." "General." Morrison's steel-gray eyes moved from Brad to Sarah, taking in her obvious distress and the defensive posture of the teenager surrounding her. "I see," he said with the measured tone of someone who had dealt with difficult situations throughout his career. "And what, exactly, are you discussing about military service?" "As I mentioned, this is a subject that's quite close to my heart." Kyle Peterson, apparently not reading the room correctly, decided to involve the general in their harassment campaign. "Actually, sir, we were just trying to help Sarah understand that she shouldn't be going around with fake military medals. This Purple Heart she's got is obviously a reproduction that she bought online. We're trying to teach her about stolen valor and why it's wrong to pretend about military service." The general's expression didn't change, but Sarah noticed a subtle shift in his posture that suggested Kyle's words had struck a nerve. "I see," General Morrison repeated, his voice carrying a new edge that anyone familiar with military discipline would have recognized as a warning sign. "And what makes you so confident that this medal is fake?" Trevor Hamilton, emboldened by what he perceived as adult support for their position, stepped forward eagerly. "Well, sir, we've been researching online, and you can buy replica Purple Hearts for like $30. Plus, look at Sarah's family. They're not exactly the type of people who would have real military heroes. Her dad works at the grain elevator, which isn't exactly what you'd expect from a war hero." The general's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly at Trevor's words. Throughout his career, he had encountered prejudice and assumptions about military service, but he had never lost his anger at those who believed that heroism was limited to certain social or economic classes. Some of the bravest soldiers he had known had come from the most humble backgrounds, and some of the greatest acts of courage he had witnessed had been performed by people who asked for nothing in return. "Young man," General Morrison said, his voice taking on the tone he had once used to discipline junior officers, "I think you might be making some assumptions that aren't supported by facts. Before we go any further, I'd like to see this medal you're discussing. I have some experience with military decorations, and I might be able to help determine its authenticity." Ashley Morrison suddenly realized that she was still holding the Purple Heart behind her back, and she felt increasingly uncomfortable about her position. The general's presence had changed the entire dynamic of the situation, and she was beginning to understand that she might be in over her head. It's not really. She stammered, unsure how to explain her possession of someone else's military medal. "I believe the young lady has something that belongs to you," General Morrison said to Sarah, his tone becoming gentler as he addressed her directly. "Would you mind if I examined it? I promise to treat it with the respect it deserves, regardless of its origins." Sarah nodded gratefully, relieved to have an adult intervention in the situation. "It belonged to my father," she said, her voice still shaky from the emotional stress of the confrontation. "He served as a combat medic in Vietnam with the 1st Infantry Division. He was wounded while treating other soldiers during a firefight." The general's eyes widened slightly at Sarah's words, though he maintained his composed demeanor. The 1st Infantry Division had been his command, and he knew the unit's history intimately. If this young girl's father had indeed served as a combat medic with the Big Red One during Vietnam, Then General Morrison was looking at the daughter of a genuine hero. General Morrison extended his hand toward Ashley, and the authority in his gesture was unmistakable. "I'll need to examine that medal now," he said, his voice carrying the kind of command presence that had been honed through decades of military leadership. Ashley reluctantly handed over the Purple Heart, her earlier confidence evaporating as she realized that she was now dealing with someone who clearly knew far more about military matters than she did. The general accepted the medal with the reverence of someone who understood its true significance. He held it carefully in his weathered hands, examining it with the practiced eye of someone who had seen hundreds of such decorations throughout his career. The other customers in the diner had now turned their full attention to the unfolding scene, sensing that something significant was happening. "This is a genuine Purple Heart," General Morrison announced after a thorough examination, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "The ribbon is correct for the Vietnam era. The bronze shows the appropriate aging patterns, and the engraving on the back matches the specifications used during that period. More importantly, this medal shows the kind of wear that comes from being handled with care and respect over many years." The teenagers fell silent, their earlier bravado completely deflated by the general's authoritative assessment. Brad Thompson's face had gone pale, and he was beginning to understand the magnitude of their mistake. Ashley Morrison looked like she wanted to disappear entirely, while Kyle Peterson was frantically putting away his smartphone, apparently no longer interested in his online research. But General Morrison wasn't finished. He turned to Sarah with an expression that combined respect and curiosity. "You mentioned that your father served with the 1st Infantry Division in Vietnam. Do you happen to know his name and approximate dates of service? I commanded that division later in my career, and I made it my business to learn about the men who served before me." Sarah's voice was still shaky, but she managed to provide the information. "His name is Miguel Martinez. He served from 1969 to 1971, and he was a combat medic. He was wounded in January 1970 during the firefight near the Cambodian border while treating wounded soldiers." The general's expression changed dramatically as Sarah spoke. His eyes widened with recognition, and he took a step back as if he had been physically struck. "Miguel Martinez," he repeated slowly, his voice filled with awe. "Specialist Miguel Martinez, serial number. I can't believe it. You're Specialist Martinez's daughter." The entire diner seemed to hold its breath as General Morrison processed this information. He looked down at the Purple Heart in his hands, then back at Sarah, his expression showing a mixture of amazement and deep respect. "Your father's name is in the unit history books," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "His actions on January 15, 1970, saved 6 soldiers' lives. He's mentioned specifically in the division's official records as one of the most courageous medics of the Vietnam War." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes, but this time they were tears of pride and relief rather than humiliation. After enduring the harassment and mockery of her classmates, hearing a distinguished general validate her father's service and sacrifice was overwhelming in the best possible way. General Morrison carefully placed the Purple Heart back in its case, handling it with the reverence due to a sacred relic. "The firefight where your father was wounded was part of Operation Junction City," he continued, his voice taking on the tone of a military historian. "His unit was conducting a reconnaissance mission when they were ambushed by a reinforced enemy company. According to the after-action reports, Specialist Martinez made 4 separate trips into the kill zone to retrieve wounded soldiers, continuing to provide medical treatment even after he was wounded by mortar shrapnel." The general turned to address the group of teenagers, his expression hardening as he prepared to deliver a lesson they would never forget. "I want you to understand something," he said, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. "The medal you were mocking represents courage of the highest order. It symbolizes a young man who put his life on the line for his fellow soldiers, who chose to face enemy fire rather than let his comrades die. Trevor Hamilton, who had been so confident in his earlier statements, now looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. We didn't know, he stammered weakly. We thought it was fake. You thought it was fake, General Morrison repeated, his voice carrying a dangerous edge, because you made assumptions based on prejudice and ignorance. You assumed that because this young lady's father works at a grain elevator, he couldn't possibly be a war hero. You assumed that because her family isn't wealthy, they couldn't possess something as valuable as a legitimate military decoration. The general's words hung in the air like a challenge, forcing the teenagers to confront the ugliness of their behavior and the prejudices that had motivated it. Kyle Peterson was staring at the floor, unable to meet the general's gaze, while Madison Wright looked like she was fighting back tears of shame. Let me tell you something about military service, General Morrison continued, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher addressing particularly slow students. Courage doesn't care about your family's bank account. Heroism doesn't check your social status before it calls on you. Some of the bravest soldiers I ever had the privilege to command came from the most humble backgrounds imaginable. Ashley Morrison finally found her voice, though it was barely above a whisper. We're sorry, she said, though her apology sounded hollow even to her own ears. We didn't mean to ... You didn't mean to what? The general interrupted. You didn't mean to humiliate a young woman whose father served his country with distinction. You didn't mean to mock the sacrifice of a wounded veteran. You didn't mean to display your own ignorance and prejudice for everyone to see. The general's words were like verbal slaps, each one driving home the magnitude of the teenager's misconduct. Harold Peterson was nodding approvingly from his corner booth, while Jenny Walsh was looking at the scene with obvious satisfaction. Clearly pleased to see bullies getting their comeuppance, Sarah stood quietly throughout this exchange, still processing the incredible validation she had received. To have her father's service not only confirmed but praised by such a distinguished military officer was beyond anything she had dared to hope, for when she first entered the diner, what happened next would become the defining moment of the entire confrontation, an image that would be burned into the memory of everyone present for the rest of their lives. General Morrison carefully closed the purple heart case and handed it back to Sarah with the solemnity of a religious ceremony. Then, in a gesture that stunned everyone in the diner, he stepped back and rendered a perfect military salute. The salute was crisp, precise, and filled with decades of military tradition. General Morrison's right hand moved to his temple with the practiced motion of someone who had performed this gesture thousands of times throughout his career, but never with more meaning than at this moment. His back was straight, his shoulders squared, and his expression reflected the deepest respect for the sacrifice represented by the medal Sarah held in her hands. I salute the courage of your father, General Morrison said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent diner. I salute his service to his country and his willingness to risk everything for his fellow soldiers. And the first salute the family that raised a daughter who would honor that service by sharing it with others. The silence in the diner was profound, broken only by the soft hum of the refrigeration units and the distant sound of traffic on Main Street. Every person present understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a moment when the true meaning of honor and respect was being demonstrated with perfect clarity. Harold Peterson, recognizing the significance of the moment, rose from his booth and rendered his own salute. As a Korean War veteran, he understood the brotherhood that connected all those who had served, and he wanted to add his own recognition to the general's tribute. Jenny Walsh, though she had no military background, instinctively stood as well, her hand over her heart in a gesture of respect. Even Rosie, who had been making her way toward the confrontation throughout the entire incident, stopped and placed her hand over her heart. Her late husband had served in World War II, and she had spent decades serving coffee and meals to veterans who gathered at her diner to share their stories and support each other through the challenges of civilian life. The teenagers, meanwhile, stood frozen in place, finally understanding the magnitude of what they had done. They had mocked not just a piece of metal and ribbon, but a symbol of sacrifice that connected Sarah's father to every soldier who had ever bled for his country. Their earlier confidence had evaporated completely, replaced by a shame so deep that several of them were visibly trembling. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the scene unfolding around her. To see her father's service honored in such a public and meaningful way was more than she had ever dreamed possible. The general's salute wasn't just a gesture of respect for her father. It was a validation of everything she had tried to convey in her planned presentation about the meaning of military service and sacrifice. General Morrison held his salute for a full 30 seconds, an eternity in social terms, but exactly appropriate for the gravity of the moment. When he finally lowered his hand, his expression remained solemn and respectful. "Your father's name appears in the official history of the 1st Infantry Division," he told Sarah. "His actions on that day in January 1970 are part of the permanent record of American military heroism." The general then turned his attention back to the group of teenagers, his expression hardening as he prepared to deliver the lesson they needed to hear. "I want you to understand something about the metal you were mocking," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades studying military history and tradition. "The Purple Heart is not given lightly. It represents blood shed in service to country, sacrifice made without expectation of reward, and courage displayed in the face of mortal danger." Brad Thompson, who had been the ringleader of the harassment, finally found his voice. "Sir, we made a mistake. We didn't know... we're sorry." His apology was halting and clearly inadequate, but it represented the first acknowledgement of wrongdoing from the group. "You made more than a mistake," General Morrison replied sternly. "You revealed something about your character that should concern not just you, but your families and your community. You showed that you're willing to mock what you don't understand, to attack what you perceive as weakness, and to assume the worst about people based on prejudice and ignorance." The general's words were like a surgical strike, cutting through the teenagers' defenses and forcing them to confront the reality of their behavior. Ashley Morrison was now crying openly, apparently overwhelmed by the shame of having her actions exposed so publicly. Kyle Peterson looked physically ill, while Trevor Hamilton seemed to be struggling with the realization that his assumptions about military service had been completely wrong. "But I want you to know something else," General Morrison continued, his tone becoming slightly less harsh. "This moment doesn't have to define who you are. You can choose to learn from this experience, to grow from it, and to become better people because of it. You can choose to honor military service instead of mocking it, to support veterans instead of questioning their legitimacy, and to treat all people with the respect they deserve." Madison Wright, who had been silent throughout the general's lecture, finally spoke up. "What can we do?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "How can we make this right?" General Morrison looked at each of the teenagers in turn, his expression softening slightly as he saw genuine remorse beginning to replace their earlier arrogance. "You can start by apologizing properly to Miss Martinez," he said. "Not just for your words today, but for the disrespect you showed to her father's service and sacrifice. And then you can commit to learning about military history and the sacrifices made by veterans so that you never repeat this kind of ignorance again." The moment hung suspended in the diner's charged atmosphere, with everyone waiting to see how the teenagers would respond to the general's challenge. The silence that followed General Morrison's challenge seemed to stretch for an eternity. The teenagers stood in a semicircle around Sarah, their earlier bravado completely deflated by the weight of their misconduct and the authority of the man who had called them to account. One by one, they began to grasp the true magnitude of what they had done and the shallow assumptions that had led them to mock something sacred. Brad Thompson, who had been the primary instigator of the harassment, was the first to step forward. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking slightly as he struggled to find words adequate to the situation. "Sarah," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what we said about your father and his medal. We were completely wrong, and there's no excuse for our behavior." His apology was halting and clearly inadequate, but it represented a dramatic departure from his earlier arrogance. General Morrison watched with the calculating gaze of someone who had spent decades evaluating the sincerity of subordinates, waiting to see if Brad's words would be followed by genuine remorse or merely empty platitudes designed to escape punishment. Ashley Morrison stepped forward next, tears streaming down her face as she confronted the reality of her actions. "I held your father's Purple Heart like it was a toy," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "I can't believe I did that. I can't believe I was so cruel and ignorant. Your father is a hero, and I treated his medal like it was worthless." Her tears seemed genuine, and her obvious distress suggested that the magnitude of her misconduct was finally sinking in. General Morrison noted that she was the first to acknowledge not just the wrongness of her actions, but the specific nature of her disrespect toward the medal itself. Kyle Peterson, who had been so confident in his online research, now looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. "I was wrong about everything," he admitted, his voice filled with shame. "I thought I could use the internet to prove that your father's medal was fake, but I didn't know anything about military service or what it really means to earn a Purple Heart. I'm sorry for doubting your father's courage and sacrifice." Trevor Hamilton, whose comments about Miguel's post-service employment had been particularly cruel, struggled to meet Sarah's eyes as he delivered his apology. "What I said about your father's job was terrible," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I implied that working at the grain elevator somehow meant he couldn't be a war hero, and that was completely wrong. I don't know anything about the challenges that veterans face when they come home, and I should never have made those assumptions." Madison Wright, who had laughed at the idea of Sarah's father being a legitimate veteran, was the last to speak. "I made fun of your family's service," she said, her voice barely audible. "I acted like military heroism was something that only happened to other people who weren't like your family. I was wrong about everything, and I'm ashamed of how I acted." General Morrison listened to each apology with the careful attention of someone who understood the importance of accountability and genuine remorse. When the teenagers had finished speaking, he stepped forward to address them directly. "Apologies are a beginning," he said, his voice carrying the weight of his authority, "but they must be followed by changed behavior and genuine understanding." The general then turned to Sarah, his expression softening as he prepared to share something that would provide even more validation for her father's service. "Miss Martinez," he said, "there's something else you should know about your father's actions that day in Vietnam. The official after-action report states that Specialist Martinez not only saved soldiers' lives, but that his courage under fire inspired the entire unit to rally and ultimately defeat a superior enemy force." Sarah felt her eyes welling up with tears of pride as she heard this additional detail about her father's service. The general continued, "Your father's actions that day became part of the training scenarios we used to teach new medics about courage under fire. His story was told to thousands of soldiers over the years as an example of what it means to put the welfare of others above your own safety." The revelation that her father's actions had been used to train other soldiers was overwhelming for Sarah. She had always known that her father was a hero, but to learn that his courage had been recognized at the highest levels of military leadership and used to inspire others was more than she had ever imagined. Furthermore, General Morrison continued, "I want you to know that your father's service record shows additional decorations beyond the Purple Heart. He received the Bronze Star with V device for valor, the Army Commendation Medal, and the Combat Medical Badge. These awards represent a level of distinguished service that placed him among the most respected soldiers in his unit. The teenagers listened to this recitation of Miguel's military honors with obvious amazement. Their earlier assumptions about his service had been not just wrong, but spectacularly wrong. Rather than being a minor figure whose service could be easily dismissed, Miguel Martinez had been a highly decorated soldier whose courage had been recognized at the highest levels of military command. Harold Peterson, who had been listening to the conversation from his corner booth, finally spoke up. "I'd like to add something, if I may," he said, his voice carrying the authority of age and experience. "I've known Miguel Martinez for 15 years, and he's never once mentioned his military service unless directly asked. He's the kind of man who does his duty without seeking recognition, who serves his community quietly and without fanfare. That's the mark of a true hero." The diner erupted in murmurs of agreement from the other customers, who were clearly moved by the unfolding drama and the revelation of Miguel's distinguished service record. Sarah felt surrounded by support and validation, a dramatic contrast to the isolation and harassment she had experienced just minutes earlier. General Morrison nodded approvingly at Harold's comments. "That's exactly the kind of character I would expect from a soldier of Specialist Martinez's caliber," he said. "True heroes don't seek recognition for their service. They do their duty, return home, and continue to serve their communities in whatever way they can." The atmosphere in Rosie's diner had been completely transformed. What had begun as a scene of cruel harassment had evolved into a powerful lesson about respect, honor, and the true meaning of military service. The teenagers who had mocked Sarah's father's Purple Heart now stood humbled and ashamed, while the other customers looked on with obvious approval at the justice that had been served. General Morrison recognized that this moment presented an opportunity for education that extended far beyond the immediate participants. "I want everyone here to understand something important," he said, addressing the entire diner. "What happened here today illustrates a problem that exists throughout our society. Too many people make assumptions about military service based on stereotypes and prejudices rather than facts and respect." He gestured toward Sarah, who was still clutching her father's Purple Heart case with reverent care. "This young lady came here today to prepare for a presentation about her father's service. Instead of receiving the support and respect she deserved, she was attacked by people who assumed they knew more about military service than they actually did." The general's words carried the weight of decades of experience dealing with civilian misconceptions about military service. "Every veteran has a story," he continued. "Every person who has served in our armed forces has made sacrifices that most civilians can't begin to understand. They deserve our respect, our support, and our gratitude, not our skepticism or mockery." Brad Thompson, who had been the primary instigator of the harassment, raised his hand tentatively. "Sir," he said, his voice still shaky with emotion, "what can we do to make this right? I mean, really make it right, not just apologize?" General Morrison studied the teenager for a moment, evaluating his sincerity. "That's a good question," he replied. "Real change requires more than words. It requires action and commitment to doing better in the future." The general paused, apparently formulating a response that would provide meaningful guidance. "First, you need to educate yourselves about military history and the sacrifices made by veterans. Visit the library, read books, talk to veterans in your community. Learn about the real experiences of military service so that you never again make the kind of ignorant assumptions you made today." Ashley Morrison, who had been crying throughout much of the confrontation, wiped her eyes and spoke up. "We could do a project," she suggested hesitantly. "Maybe we could research local veterans and their stories and present it to the school or the community." General Morrison nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of positive action that could come from this experience," he said. There are probably dozens of veterans in your community whose stories have never been properly told. You could help preserve their legacy and educate others about the reality of military service. Kyle Peterson, who had been so confident in his internet research earlier, raised his hand. Sir, could you help us understand how to tell the difference between real military stories and fake ones? I mean, we obviously don't know how to evaluate military service properly. That's another excellent question, the general replied. The key is to approach military service with respect and proper research, rather than skepticism and assumptions. Talk to real veterans, consult official records, and always give the benefit of the doubt to those who claim to have served. Trevor Hamilton, whose comments about Miguel's civilian employment had been particularly cruel, spoke up next. I want to apologize again for what I said about Mr. Martinez's job, he said. I didn't understand that veterans can face challenges when they return home, and that their civilian employment doesn't reflect on their military service. General Morrison seized on this comment to provide additional education. That's a very important point, he said. Many veterans struggle with the transition from military to civilian life. They may face challenges related to their service, including physical injuries, emotional trauma, or simply the difficulty of translating military skills into civilian employment. Their post-service careers don't diminish their military achievements. Madison Wright, who had been largely silent since her earlier apology, finally spoke up. General Morrison, would it be possible for us to meet Mr. Martinez? I mean, if he's willing to talk to us after what we did. The general looked at Sarah, recognizing that this decision belonged to her and her family. That would be up to Miss Martinez and her father, he said. Given the circumstances, I think they would be well within their rights to decline such a meeting. Sarah, who had been listening to the conversation with amazement, considered the request carefully. I think my father would be willing to talk to you, she said slowly. He's always believed in education and helping people understand military service. But you'd have to be genuinely interested in learning, not just going through the motions. We are, Brad said earnestly. We want to learn. We want to understand what we did wrong and how to do better. General Morrison smiled for the first time since entering the diner. That's the attitude that can turn this negative experience into something positive, he said. Miss Martinez, your father would be proud not just of how you handled this difficult situation, but of your willingness to help these young people learn from their mistakes. Harold Peterson, who had been observing the entire exchange from his corner booth, stood up and approached the group. If you're serious about learning, he said, addressing the teenagers, I'd be willing to help too. I served in Korea, and I know several other veterans in town who might be willing to share their stories with respectful young people. The offer from Harold seemed to energize the teenagers, who were beginning to see how they could transform their shameful behavior into a positive learning experience. Ashley Morrison was the first to respond. We'd be honored to hear your stories, she said, her voice reflecting genuine interest rather than the superficial politeness of earlier Rosie, who had been watching the entire scene unfold from behind the counter, finally spoke up. This diner has been serving veterans for 40 years, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed decades of military service and sacrifice. We've heard countless stories from brave men and women who served their country. You're all welcome to come back and learn from them, but you'd better come with respect and genuine interest. As the confrontation drew to a close, General Morrison prepared to deliver his final message to the group. What happened here today doesn't have to be the end of the story, he said. You can choose to make this the beginning of something better, a commitment to honoring military service, supporting veterans, and treating all people with the respect they deserve. The general then turned to Sarah one final time. Miss Martinez, please give my regards to your father. Tell him that his service continues to inspire others, and that his daughter represented his legacy with dignity and courage today. Sarah nodded, clutching the Purple Heart case to her chest. "I will, sir. Thank you for everything you did today." As General Morrison prepared to leave the diner, he paused at the door and delivered one final message to everyone present. "Remember," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet restaurant, "freedom isn't free. It's purchased with the blood and sacrifice of people like Specialist Miguel Martinez. We owe it to them to honor their service and to never forget the price they paid for our liberty." The bell above the door chimed as the general left, but his words continued to resonate throughout the diner long after he had disappeared into the Nebraska afternoon. 2 hours later, Sarah stood before her American history class at Millbrook High School, her father's Purple Heart case open on the desk. Beside her, the presentation she had prepared so carefully that morning had been transformed by the events at Rosie's diner into something far more powerful and meaningful than she had ever imagined possible. Mrs. Patterson, her teacher, had introduced the presentation with unusual solemnity after Sarah had briefly explained what had happened at the diner. Word of the confrontation had spread quickly through the school, as such stories always do in small towns, and the entire class was paying attention with an intensity that was rare for teenagers. "Today, I want to tell you about my father's service in Vietnam," Sarah began, her voice steady and confident despite the emotional roller coaster she had experienced. "But before I do, I want to share something that happened to me just a few hours ago that taught me even more about the importance of honoring military service." She proceeded to tell the story of her encounter with her classmates at the diner, speaking honestly about the harassment she had endured and the assumptions that had been made about her father's service. Her classmates listened with rapt attention, many of them clearly uncomfortable as they recognized attitudes and prejudices that they had encountered or even held themselves. "A retired general happened to come into the diner while this was happening," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger as she reached the climax of her story. "He not only confirmed that my father's Purple Heart was authentic, but he told me that my father's actions in Vietnam had been used to train other soldiers for decades." The revelation that General Morrison had recognized Miguel's service and honored it so publicly sent a murmur of amazement through the classroom. Several students who had been friends with the teenagers involved in the harassment looked visibly ashamed, apparently understanding that they could have easily been part of the group that had mocked Sarah's father. Sarah then launched into her prepared presentation about her father's military service, but now it was enhanced by the additional information she had learned from General Morrison. She spoke about the specific battles Miguel had fought, the soldiers he had saved, and the decorations he had earned. She explained the significance of the Purple Heart and the courage required to earn it. "My father never talks about his service unless he's asked," Sarah explained, echoing Harold Peterson's earlier comments. "He came home from Vietnam and built a quiet life for our family. He works at the grain elevator, he volunteers at the VFW, and he's taught me that true heroism doesn't seek recognition, it just does what needs to be done." As Sarah concluded her presentation, she held up her father's Purple Heart for the entire class to see. "This medal represents more than just my father's service," she said. "It represents the sacrifice of every person who has served in our military, the price of the freedoms we enjoy, and the responsibility we all have to honor and support those who serve." The class erupted in applause that seemed to go on forever, with students rising to their feet in a spontaneous standing ovation. Mrs. Patterson had tears in her eyes as she watched her students respond to Sarah's presentation with genuine respect and understanding. After class, several students approached Sarah to ask questions about her father's service and to express their admiration for how she had handled the difficult situation at the diner. Many admitted that they had never really thought seriously about military service or the sacrifices made by veterans, and Sarah's presentation had opened their eyes to realities they had never considered. That evening, Sarah returned home to find her father waiting for her in the living room. Miguel Martinez was a man of medium height with graying hair and gentle eyes that carried the weight of experiences most people could never imagine. When Sarah walked through the door, he stood and embraced her with the kind of hug that communicated pride, love, and understanding without the need for words. "I heard about what happened today," Miguel said quietly, his voice carrying the same quiet strength that had sustained him through combat and civilian life. "Harold Peterson called me and told me about the general who stood up for you. I want you to know how proud I am of how you handled yourself." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes as she realized that her father's reaction wasn't anger or disappointment, but pride in her courage and dignity. "Dad, I was so scared," she admitted. "They were saying terrible things about your service, and I didn't know how to make them understand what your Purple Heart really means." Miguel took his daughter's hands in his own, hands that had once treated wounded soldiers under enemy fire and now bore the calluses of honest civilian labor. "You did exactly what you should have done," he said. "You stood up for what was right, you honored our family service, and you showed more courage than those teenagers could understand." He paused, looking down at the Purple Heart case that Sarah still carried. "You know, I never wanted this medal to define me," he continued. "I did what any soldier would do in that situation. I took care of my fellow soldiers. But I'm glad that it can serve as a teaching tool, a way to help people understand the reality of military service and sacrifice." Sarah handed the case to her father, who opened it and looked down at the medal with the same mixture of pride and sadness that she had seen countless times throughout her childhood. "General Morrison said that your actions that day saved 6 soldiers' lives," she said. "He said your story was used to train other medics about courage under fire." Miguel's eyes widened slightly at this information. He had never known that his actions had been studied or used for training purposes, and the revelation that his courage had helped prepare other soldiers was deeply moving. "I hope it helped them," he said simply. "I hope it helped them save lives and come home safely to their families." The father and daughter sat together in comfortable silence for several minutes, both processing the events of the day and their significance. Finally, Miguel spoke again. "The teenagers who harassed you today, they're not bad kids, they're just ignorant. They've never faced real challenges or understood what sacrifice means. Today was probably the first time they encountered something bigger than their own small world." Sarah was amazed by her father's compassion for the young people who had mocked his service. "How can you be so understanding?" she asked. "They were cruel and disrespectful." Miguel smiled with the wisdom that comes from decades of experience with human nature in both its worst and best forms. "Because I remember being young and thinking I knew everything," he said. "Because I've seen good people do bad things when they're scared or ignorant. And because I believe that people can learn and grow from their mistakes if they're given the opportunity." As if summoned by their conversation, the doorbell rang. Miguel and Sarah looked at each other with curiosity before Miguel went to answer the door. Standing on their front porch were Brad Thompson, Ashley Morrison, Kyle Peterson, Trevor Hamilton, and Madison Wright, the 5 teenagers who had harassed Sarah at the diner. The group looked nervous and uncomfortable, clearly unsure of their reception after the events of the afternoon. Brad Thompson, who had been the ringleader of the harassment, stepped forward as their spokesman. "Mr. Martinez," he said, his voice shaky with emotion, "we came to apologize for our behavior today and to ask if you would be willing to talk to us about your military service." Miguel studied the teenagers for a moment, evaluating their sincerity and commitment to learning from their mistakes. He could see genuine remorse in their expressions, and he recognized the courage it had taken for them to come to his home and face the man whose service they had mocked. "Come in," he said simply, stepping aside to allow them to enter. "I think we have some things to discuss." What followed was a conversation that would change all of their lives. Miguel spent the next 2 hours sharing his experiences in Vietnam. Not just the heroic moments that had earned him decorations, but the daily realities of military service, the bonds formed with fellow soldiers, and the challenges of returning to civilian life. He spoke about the friends he had lost, the wounds he had carried, both visible and invisible, and the way military service had shaped his understanding of duty, honor, and sacrifice. The teenagers listened with rapt attention, asking thoughtful questions and beginning to understand the complexity and depth of military service. They learned about the Vietnam War from someone who had actually been there, who had experienced the confusion, fear, and courage that characterized that conflict. They gained an appreciation for the price of freedom that went far beyond anything they had learned in textbooks or movies. By the end of the evening, the 5 teenagers had committed to working with Sarah on a project to document the stories of local veterans. They would spend the following months interviewing veterans throughout Millbrook, learning about their service and preserving their stories for future generations. The project would eventually become a permanent exhibit at the local library and would inspire similar efforts in neighboring communities. The transformation of these 5 teenagers from ignorant bullies to passionate advocates for veterans would become legendary in Millbrook. Their project would win state awards and would be featured in newspapers throughout Nebraska. More importantly, it would help bridge the gap between the military and civilian communities, fostering greater understanding and respect for those who serve. General Morrison, who had continued his journey to Colorado that afternoon, would later learn about the positive outcome of his intervention at Rosie's diner. He would stay in touch with the Martinez family and would eventually return to Millbrook to speak at the dedication of the Veterans exhibit that grew out of that day's events. Years later, when Sarah graduated from high school and decided to pursue a career in military history, she would credit that day at Rosie's diner as the moment that changed her life's direction. She would go on to earn a Ph.D. in American military history and would write extensively about the experiences of Vietnam veterans and the challenges they faced upon returning home. Miguel Martinez would continue to work at the grain elevator until his retirement, never seeking recognition for his military service, but always willing to share his experiences with those who showed genuine interest in learning. He would become a regular speaker at school events and veterans gatherings, helping to educate new generations about the realities of military service and sacrifice. The Purple Heart Medal would remain in the Martinez family, passed down as a symbol not just of individual courage, but of the ongoing responsibility to honor those who serve and to never forget the price of freedom. It would serve as a reminder that heroism comes in many forms, that prejudice and ignorance can be overcome through education and understanding, and that even the smallest acts of courage can have far-reaching consequences. The story of what happened at Rosie's diner on that October afternoon would be told and retold throughout Millbrook for generations, becoming part of the town's oral history and serving as a powerful reminder of the importance of treating all people with respect and dignity. It would be a story about the power of truth to overcome lies, of courage to defeat cowardice, and of respect to triumph over mockery. But most importantly, it would be a story about the enduring value of military service and the responsibility that all Americans share to honor and support those who have sacrificed for their freedom. In a small town in Nebraska, a teenage girl's courage and a general's intervention had created a moment of justice that would resonate far beyond the walls of a local diner, touching lives and changing hearts in ways that none of them could have. Imagine. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.